I've been looking forward to this panel for the whole, since we had the idea of doing it. This is a historic panel, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I believe these three men are the only three people alive who drew Batman professionally before 1962. That alone is amazing. Bob Kane had three main ghost artists. He had a lot of people who ghosted from over the years. He had three main ghost artists. These are the three men. We have them together for the first time together. You also, if you were looking up here about 2 minutes ago, you saw a historic moment. You saw Lou Sayre Schwartz meet Sheldon Moldoff for the first time ever. Anyway, folks, on the far end, this is Mr. Sheldon Moldoff. In the center, Mr. Jerry Robinson. And near me, Mr. Lou Sayre Schwartz. Now, by way of history, let me explain briefly that Bob Kane, when he started out with DC, had ghost artists from the start. We will talk about that. He made a deal, and for a while the stories were done by his studio. People who assisted him, people who ghosted for him, people who worked for him. He did some, but we'll talk about how much he did. At some point down the line, around the mid-40s, he made a deal with DC, a contract, about 45, where his studio continued to produce X number of pages per month. And DC had other stories done by people in the office. They were also signed Bob Kane, stories that Kane had nothing to do with. Kurt Swan drew some of those, Jim Mooney drew some of those, Winslow Mortimer drew some of those, Dick Sprang drew a lot of those. Those were not people who, those people who did art, Batman art that was signed Bob Kane, but that did not go through the Bob Kane studio. These gentlemen did work through the Bob Kane studio. Increasingly, over the years, Bob Kane did less and less and less of it. Again, we'll talk about that. To the point where, for years, the great Batman art that you thought was by Bob Kane was by Shelley Moldoff. Or the great Batman art that you thought was by Bob Kane was by Lou Schwartz. And the style that you thought was Bob Kane's style came from Jerry Robinson. I met Bob Kane in 1966, and he invited me up to his apartment on Wilshire Boulevard to talk about comics. And he sat there drinking vodka and telling me about how much he hated everybody in comics who had screwed him over and such. And at that point, thank you, my lunch has arrived. At that point, they had just made the deal for he'd renegotiated his contract with DC, and for the very first time, they were about to have stories appearing in Batman that did not have his signature on it. I actually handed Bob Kane the first issue of Batman that said, drawn by Irv Novick on it. It was not the first time Irv Novick had drawn Batman, it was the first time that anybody admitted it was not Bob Kane in the credits, when they put credits on it. And Bob was drinking, and he started telling me about his ghost artists. And he mentioned all three of these gentlemen. It's the first time I'd ever heard of Lou Sayre Schwartz, ever heard his name. Bob told me about him. First time I ever heard of Dick Sprang. It's the first time I ever heard that this guy Jerry Robinson had been drawing stuff for him. And I didn't put together that this was the same Jerry Robinson who was drawing. Was it Still Life at the time you were doing, about mid-60s? Still Life newspaper strip. I just figured that was a different Jerry Robinson. I knew Shelley Moldoff's work. Shelley Moldoff was the guy who did those beautiful Golden Age Hawkman stories, and he did all these other wonderful things over the years, and did these, and practically invented horror comics in the late 40s. I didn't know that Shelley Moldoff was doing all those stories. Let's try to tell you some of that story now, and go back here. Now, which of you gentlemen met Bob Kane first of the three of you? Was it Jerry? Was it with you? Did you meet him before Shelley?
I'm not sure. I met Bob.
I met Bob in 1940. That was his first.
So Jerry was before that.
I was in 39.
Jerry, get a little closer to the mic. And tell us, and Jerry, tell us, and when did you meet with Bob?
Let's see, it was 19...
If you say you were for 40, impossible. I was his first assistant. I came out of high school and started working.
1946.
Okay, Lou, we're going to hold off to Lou because he didn't meet him until 46. Jerry and Shelley are playing bit a note. All right? Jerry, tell us the story of how you met Bob Kane.
Well, first of all, I just want to correct the record a little bit. I started on Batman in 39. I think Sheldon had assisted him before me. But
Okay.
I don't know. I met him in 39. I started in 39, the second or third issue, summer of 39.
Hold on here. Now, Shelley, when did you meet Bob? Get it to the mic, into the mic, into the mic.
I just come out of high school.
You're not talking to the mic, Shelley, talking to the
I
mic.
met him in 38. I just came out of high school, and somebody said there's an artist living on the Grand Concourse in New York, and he needs an assistant. He came up with a strip, and they're looking for somebody. And so that he gave me the telephone number. I took the trolley over there, and that's how I met Bob King.
Can you hear him okay in the back? No, okay. Shelley, you got to get closer to the microphone. I'm sorry. Shelley, tell that again. Into the microphone.
You want me to start all over again?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay.
With your
I just graduated high school, and a friend of mine in the neighborhood said he heard that an artist that lived on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx was looking for an assistant. He came up with a new strip, a new book, and he needs help. So he gave me his number, and I called him, and I went over to see Bob. And I started doing backgrounds and lettering and things like that, and I did it for quite a few months. As a matter of fact, one of the first things I did, which kind of cemented a friendship and a trust between me and Bob, it was called the Batman. And when I started inking and lettering, I said, Bob, what do we need thee for? Let's forget about the thee, just call it Batman. He says, great, you're right in tune with me. And we became friends, and I was a friend of his all his life. He was the most miserable character there was, but I had to weigh different things. A lot of artists were very good, and they couldn't find enough work to stay in the industry, so they left. I never wanted for work. I had so much work that I never missed a day, and this is my 70th year as a comic book pro. And knowing Bob, I realized that the man, emotionally and privately, was not 100%. And he would need all the help he could get. He had a kind of a twisted mind. Now, are you familiar with the story, the picture of Dorian Gray? Okay, Dorian Gray made a deal and sold his soul as long as he wouldn't age. He wanted to remain that handsome young fellow that he was. So they had a painting made, and it was in his closet. And every time he did something sinful, it didn't come out on him personally. It came out on the painting. And as the movie went on, you got a glimpse of the painting. It got more horrible as it went along. And I used to kid Bob, and I'd say, Bob, you know, the closest thing that I can think about you is you're like Dorian Gray. You're always dressed impeccably, you're a big ladies' man, you always got your little cravat, you're handsome. I'd love to see the painting in the closet. You must have. And he thought that was very funny. It wasn't funny. I was honestly telling my own beliefs about this man, because he was not a nice man. He had a lot of personality, he loved the women and all that there, but he was a personification of evil. And how he could come with his mind to create what would be the biggest superhero of all time. Now, early on, I started doing a lot of work for Vincent Sullivan and Sheldon Mayer. And I got an offer to work for another syndicate in Cleveland. And when I came to the office, Jack Leibowitz and Max Gaines, the two principal owners of National Comics, which came to DC, he said to me, "You got a letter from NEA Syndicate in Cleveland?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, what, did they offer you a job?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "You know, Shelley, we would like you to stay here. We think the comic book is your future." I said, "But Jack, everybody wants to work for a syndicate. That's where it is, the newspaper comics. Every artist wanted to work for a newspaper." He said, "The comic book is going to be the thing." But he says, I want to do more than that. He says, "I want you to stay and work with Bob Kane." He says, "Bob has a character that I think," we're going back to 1940s. He said, "I think it would be the biggest superhero ever." He had that tremendous confidence in Batman. And he said, "But Bob is not going to be able to handle it." He says, "I want you to stay with Bob." He says, we'll make it up to you. You can get anything you want, but I want you to stay with him. Because eventually, Batman will be the top superhero." And so I thought about it, and I decided, okay, I'll stay. So that my relationship with Bob started in the 40, or 38 or 39, whatever, and went until he passed away. He sat on something that became a phenomenon. And due to the help he had from different people, like Jerry, Lou, and myself, it became more and more popular. His contribution was nil, really. But he used to say to me, "Let me just talk and you listen to me, and then try to carry out my feelings about Batman. You have to interpret it." And that's the way we went on, and we were on, as I say, for close to 70 years. And he said, "You're right on the same wavelength as me, or I can't think of these things." But it was the way we worked. We socialized. His daughter was the same age as my daughter, and so she used to spend weekends at my home in Jersey. And we went out socially, etc., but he was a very weird man. But there's one thing you cannot take away from him, and that's Batman. No matter what people say or whatever, Bob Kane is Batman, period. And I was lucky to tag along all these years, because there came a time where he had to guarantee over 350 pages a year. So I did maybe 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 pages about him over the years. And funny thing is, I get a lot of mail from fans all over the world. And they thank me for the hours and years of pleasure that they got. And they were all dedicated Batman fans. And also mainly comic book fans. And so it's a great honor to me to be associated with something that had that much influence on the people. And I can only say that maybe I was lucky. I was there at the right time, the right place, and Batman did eventually become the greatest superhero ever. And I have to thank Jack Leibowitz for sticking by me and talking me into staying in comics. And it's been a long trip. It's been 70 years. That's 2 generations, and I'm very fortunate. When I was 7 or 8, I loved to draw. Now I'm much older, I still love to draw. And I spent my whole life drawing. I never had a contract in my life, just drew, period. And if I could do it over again, I'd do the exact same thing. Thank you.
How's that? Is that better? No, it isn't. Okay, any place here? This one working? Yeah. Okay. All right, thank you. I'm sorry. We've had more problems with the microphone here. Shelley, can you pinpoint for us the first published Batman art you did? Can you tell us what that was?
The first Batman?
The first published Batman art you contributed?
Oh, I can hardly remember. I can hardly remember. The first one,
It was in Detective Comics.
I didn't, I just did it. It was a job, period. I never thought it's going to still be going, 70, 80 years later. So I didn't pay much attention. Whatever was there,
But it predated Batman #1. Batman was in Detective Comics.
say that again.
Batman was in, say it on the microphone. Batman was in Detective Comics at the time, just in Detective Comics. You didn't work on the first story, right?
Didn't work on the what?
You didn't work on the very first Batman story.
I have bad hearing. I don't.
Did you work on the first Batman story ever?
I believe I did, yeah.
Did Bob have anyone else working with him?
Not that I know, not at that time.
Did Bob do any of the art?
At the beginning, yes, he did.
How much did he do?
He would pencil everything. He would pencil. And
Was
then he
he-
would
was he
leave the
any good?
backgrounds and the finishing to somebody else,
Was he any good as an artist?
Let me say this. He created Batman, and he gave it the feeling that nobody else could do. He did it from within. He was very dedicated, and I give him the credit for creating the character. Now, we all added something to it. That's natural. But he himself, I give full credit for Batman.
Tell us some of what you added to it. What did you add to the look of the
I
character?
don't remember. Maybe I would say, as long as you have him on a rooftop, why don't you have a shadow or something, little suggestions like that. First of all, nobody thinks of it in terms of longevity. It's just another job, period. That's all we thought of. It's another job. As long as he pays and I got work, fine. Nobody would ever imagine it's going to be the #1 superhero of all time.
The early Batman stories had a lot of swipes in them, tracings from other comic strips and pulp illustrations. Is that Bob? Was he tracing other people's work? Was he swiping from other people's work?
I think we all leaned on other people at one time or another. I leaned a lot on Raymond because I thought his style was the future, particularly with superheroes and things like that. Bob would, if he saw something he liked, he would swipe it. That's all. That was that simple. But we didn't look at it in those terms. Our defense to that was, we're young, we don't have the money to go to art school, we don't have the time to take training. Let's use every available means we can to help us. So swipes became a very important part of our portfolio. Because you can't, at that age, you can't know possibly how to draw everything. Now, if you want to do an airplane, if you want to do a car, you've got to get a picture of an airplane. So the same thing is true of different scenes, different things, anything to help you make a better picture. Like if you ever been to the Norman Rockwell Museum, he was a great painter, but before he made a cover for Saturday Evening Post or any other magazine, he took dozens of pictures of different people, different positions, and then he put them all together and figured out this guy would be good sitting on a chair. Let's put the dog in there someplace. And to me, that's the same thing as a swipe. You're using everything to make a better product. And so a lot of our artists, just like myself, we tried different things to help us make a better product. And it worked for most people.
People in the back, if you can't hear anybody, wave to me. Put your hand behind your ear and signal me, please. Now, you worked on the early detective stories. Did you leave him for a while there?
Who, Bob?
Bob, did you stop working for him for a while?
Yeah. I left him, and I'll tell you the reason. I was working at his house, and I said, Bob, I have a great idea. He says, what? I said, I'm going to do a superhero, but it's going to be a boy, a young boy. And he didn't say anything, and I left. And I kept working, and then about a month later, I go into Vincent Sullivan to bring some work in, and on the table I see Batman and Robin the Boy Wonder. I said, Vincent, that's my idea. I just discussed that with Bob. So he says, well, we've had a lot of trouble with Bob on plagiarism. You say the word, I'll kill the book. So I thought about it, and I said, Vincent, I cannot 100% say that he wasn't thinking of the same thing. All our artists, all writers are always trying to come up with new characters. I said, I cannot tell you, Vincent, that he took my idea. I honestly can't. And so he says, well, it's up to you what you want me to do. I said, just forget about it. I didn't see Bob for about 8 years after that. And then I met him at an outing at the Cartoonist Society, and we shook hands, became friends again, and he said, I need an assistant. You want a job? And I said, what'll it pay? And he told me, I says, shake. And from that point on, until he passed away, I was his assistant.
Okay, now, you left him. Now, Jerry, let's get to your story when you came in working with him. You met him on Helmet Tennis Court.
Well, the summer I graduated high school, 1939, I sold ice cream in the back of I had a cart, and I pedaled a bicycle with a cart in back. And I was given the outskirts of town. This was Trenton, New Jersey, where I grew up. And I spent the summer, or a good part of it, selling ice cream to earn enough money for the first semester at college. And about midsummer, my mother was afraid I was not going to last the summer. I was down to about 78 pounds. And so she persuaded me to take $25 from my hard-earned money. I think I got a cent and a half commission for every popsicle. It takes a lot of popsicles to earn $25. And I did go to a resort, and my sport was tennis primarily. All my brothers, I had 3 older brothers who were tennis champions, and I followed suit. And so I rushed out to the court at this resort that I went to fatten up, supposedly, to play tennis, and I wore a jacket that was a painter's jacket, an ordinary linen painter's jacket that had a lot of pockets in it. And it was I decorated it with cartoons, which was the fad of the day. We took it up from college. Princeton University was nearby, and we saw the college kids wearing these painter's jackets decorated, so that's what I did with mine. And I used it as a warm-up jacket for tennis. So I put on the jacket and ran up to the court and looking for a partner. And I felt a tap on my shoulder. And the voice said, I didn't even turn around. The voice said, who did those drawings? And I said, I did. I thought I was going to be arrested or something. And he said, well, they're pretty good. And he introduced himself as Bob Kane. By strangest coincidence, he was taking a week off at this very same resort. And so we got to talking. He took me down to the local candy store where they're selling comic books. I'd never seen one before. And there's the first issue of Batman. And I wasn't terribly impressed, frankly. So once talking, I found out what I was doing. I said, well, I'm going to study journalism in the fall. I'm accepted in Syracuse University. He said, well, gee, it's too bad if you were coming to New York. I need an assistant on Batman. And fortunately, I had applied to Columbia, excuse me, and also Penn, University of Pennsylvania, and I was accepted in the 3, but I decided to go to Syracuse. It sounded more like a college town. I had never been any one of the 3 before. And so I said, well, too bad if you were coming to New York, I could give you this job. So I quick ran to the phone, called Columbia to see if my application was still good, and luckily it was. I called Syracuse University and said I was not coming, and Penn, and I called home and I said, I'm not coming home, I'm going to New York, I have a job with Batman. I decided to go to Columbia. So that was my introduction. The other thing I could tell you that I had never been in New York, and certainly from the mountains, I didn't know how to get there. So I asked at the desk, how do I get to New York? And they gave me some convoluted instructions. I had to change buses at various places to get to New York from the mountains. And they said, but Jan Pierce, I don't know if any of you had heard him, you don't go back that far as I do, but he was the great tenor at the Metropolitan Opera. And he happened to be singing at that resort that weekend. You know, they always had entertainment. So he said, why don't you go up to Mr. Pierce? He's just leaving for New York. He's a very nice man. He might give you a ride in. So I timidly went up to him, and Mr. Pierce, I said, the man at the desk, the manager said that you were going to New York and you might have room. He said, sure, kid, hop in. He had a block-long limousine with a chauffeur. And so that was my grand entrance to New York by Jan Pierce, the great tenor. And we got to the Bronx and he kicked me out. Luckily I had an aunt living in New York, so the first couple of nights till I got a room, I stayed there and started my classes at Columbia, and I first started during the day and just working at night with Bob, and then I reversed it. But that was my entrance. But there's one thing I'd like to correct. I appreciate Shelley's input and his experiences, but I have to correct the record in one place. Bob co-created Batman. His co-creator was Bill Finger. And I was there when Bill added all the great things about him. And I'll tell you why I believe so. He wrote all the first stories of Batman. His origin, the first adventures. He even wrote the first Joker story, which I created, and I'll explain that in a moment. But he helped design the costume. He added all the equipments of Batman, the Batmobile, the Bat Signal. They were all Bob's. Bob signed, but they were all Bill's ideas. Bob was not a writer, and he didn't write one script of Batman. I can say that. And so Bill deserved all credit as a co-creator of Batman. Being very close to Bill, he was really my cultural mentor. He must have been about 24 or 5. I was 17 when I started on Batman. He took me all to the great museums in New York, MoMA, Modern Museum, Metropolitan. He took me to foreign films and where they were showing. And he was a very prolific reader. He read everything. He had a great mind that he retained all the essential parts. But the only thing with the scripts, he was not prolific. He was a very careful craftsman. And he was pioneering, as we all were, a new medium. The comics in that narrative form, the sequential narrative which we were starting, didn't exist before. So everything we did was done for the first time. There was no past. We hardly thought of the future. We were just living the present. And it was a very exciting time. It was like the time, I guess, of the first motion pictures. When the first close-up was done, when the first pan shot, all the techniques of manipulating time, we were experimenting with in the comics. And we had a great thrill when we heard that some of the great directors in the film, like Fellini, who was an aspiring cartoonist, loves the comics, even Charlie Chaplin, and of course Orson Welles when he did Citizen Kane was a revolution. I was sitting next to, in the studio, next to Fred Ray, who did all the great Superman covers. And at times we collaborated on covers. I would do the Batman figures and he would do the Superman figures. But he and I went to see Citizen Kane. I think I saw it 20 some times and he was probably near 40. And we were sitting at our adjoining desk and recite whole scenes while we were drawing of Citizen Kane. That's how much of an impact it made in storytelling to us. And I think all of us, I mean, the other side of me was Jack Kirby. We had a great bullpen at that time. It was Jack Kirby, Joe Shuster, Superman. We first became friends then. He was still doing some of the drawing. Fred Ray, George Russo's, and Mort Meskin made up that bullpen at that time. I started in the summer of '39 on the second or third issue of Batman, which was in Detective Comics. The following year, in 40, was when I came up with the idea for the Joker, and that was 41. And Batman #1, I think, was, you would know the date of that one.
Everybody else here, they dated Batman #1.
March 40.
1940.
So it wasn't long after I had started, maybe 6 months.
All right, now I want to clarify something here for the record. You said that when you met Bob at the tennis court, he took you over to the candy store and he showed you the first Batman.
Yeah.
He wasn't showing you Batman #1, he was showing
No,
you
Detective.
number 27.
Yes.
All right? So there's a lead time there. When you started working for him, you said you started with the second or third Batman stories? Wouldn't it have
For
been...
Detective.
What?
For Detective.
Okay. Wouldn't it have been, because you didn't start with him that minute,
No.
wouldn't it have been more likely that you started with him with like the fifth or sixth story, because the second one was already depressed by the time you saw the first one, the third one was probably drawn.
Well, there was a monthly, and we had a lot of advanced time. You know, we weren't involved in the schedule for Batman
But I mean, from the moment you started, you met him on the tennis court, to when you started actually working for him, how long was that?
Well, I went right to New York and started.
So it was like a week or two?
A
So you
week
might
or-
have started with
yeah.
the third or fourth story.
I think it had to be the third or so.
Okay.
From when I looked at it.
Now,
Probably the second was
was
in the
Shelley,
works.
was Shelley gone by then?
I never met Shelley until many years later. So we never came in contact.
No,
No.
no.
All right, now Shelley, how many stories did you think you were, Shelley?
I bought some pencils from him once. He was standing outside of D.C. And I dropped a day's pay in there for a couple of pencils.
All right, but now, okay, we want to clarify this. Shelley, how many, to the microphone, how many stories did you work on before you left him, Batman stories for Detective
Well,
Comics?
I have no idea. I can't answer that.
Could it have been 2?
I have no idea. Oh, more than 2. No,
More than 5?
Roughly. I can't honestly say. Those things were not important to us. The important thing to us at that time was to try and make a living.
Yeah, I understand.
As an artist.
But I'm trying to figure out how long you worked for him. Did you
Oh,
do 2 or 3 stories, maybe?
A couple of months.
Okay, so you might have done 2 or 3 stories, and Jerry might have started. I'm trying to
Whatever,
figure
yeah.
out if Jerry followed you exactly.
Right.
Oh, yes, I know that.
Was there
Because I
anyone-
knew of Shelley.
So there was no one in between the two of you?
No, absolutely not.
All right. So Shelley leaves, he runs into Jerry on the tennis court, hires him, and you stayed with him for how long?
Well, I only stayed with him about 1 year, and Bill Finger and I were going to leave.
The microphone.
I'm sorry. Bill Finger and I were going to leave. We kept asking for a raise, which was not forthcoming, and because we were doing the whole job by that time. And so Bill and I, as I said, Bill and I were very close. And so we were going to leave. Somehow, DC Comics never knew we existed until word got around that we were leaving. And then they found out that we were the ones that were doing Batman. And so I got offers, as did Bill, from practically every publisher. I remember Busy Arnold, who did, what was his thing, what was the publisher? What books did he do? Quality Comics. Yeah, he was one of the big publishers. He would take me to dinner maybe about once a month to try to persuade me to come over to Quality. They wanted, all the publishers wanted somebody who had something to do with the success of Batman. Well, at that time, there were just 3 of us, Bob, Bill Finger, and myself. And at one time, Busy Arnold, who was the publisher of Quality, offered me the job to edit all of their books, do the lead feature, and manage their whole string of books. Well, that was pretty heady. I was 18, I guess, at that time, the following year. And DC, Jack Leibowitz called us in to try to persuade us not to leave, Bill Finger and myself. And so the deal, it was a hard choice. On one hand, the other opportunity of doing my own features was very attractive, but I was so young at the time, I really didn't appreciate the enormity of that offer. And DC was anxious, obviously, to keep that nucleus of the Batman team together. And so the deal, and both of us finally wound up staying with Batman. And my arrangement was I was able to do in addition to finishing Bob's stories, I was able to draw, pencil and ink my own stories of Batman, and most of the covers, which I particularly like doing. And I like doing symbolic covers. And that was part of the deal. And Bill also increased his position. But I think Bill had a deal where he could also take on outside work beside Batman. But I think his deal was that Batman came first. He had to do all the Batman assignments. I didn't have any restrictions, but there was, I just didn't have time to moonlight, except for after a couple of years I began to take on stories of my own for other publishers, because I was anxious to write as well as draw, because that was I still had the ambitions of being a writer and journalist, and until I really got involved in the art and found the adventures of doing writing and drawing of my own, where I could take a story from the beginning to the end, was particularly exciting. And so I moonlighted in my own stories, or I did other writing outside. But Batman was confined to drawing and giving ideas, as I did with Bill, particularly on the first Joker story.
Okay, now, was there anyone else who worked on Batman? Did George Russo's work on Batman stuff with you then?
Oh, yes. While I was still with Bob for that first year, I began to take on, particularly when Batman Quarterly started. We now were confronted with doing 4 stories a month, quarterly, 1 story a month for DC, for Detective, and then we had added World's Finest. So there was a big load of work overnight. So we hired George Russo to assist me, and he just inked the backgrounds, and I inked the figures and did all the penciling that was available. And we had an office in the New York Times building in Times Square for about a year until we made that deal with DC. And from then on, technically, I didn't work for Bob. I was working directly for DC, as did Bill Finger.
Now, who worked for Bob after you left?
No one at the studio. Everything was done at DC Comics.
So Bob wasn't producing out of his own studio for a while?
Well, he never, I don't know what you mean by studio. He never had a studio as such. The studio was his bedroom in the apartment.
Was DC not contracting with Bob for Batman art?
Yes.
So who was doing that Batman art?
We were.
Okay, but after you stopped, who was doing it?
Oh, well, I didn't leave until 46 or 47.
Okay, 46. Got it.
Okay.
Lou.
Okay.
When did you meet Bob Cave?
You're on.
Get to the mic. Get up to the mic. Close to the mic.
Want me closer?
Close to the mic.
Well, I got out of the Navy and went to Florida, where I had a sister living there. And,
A little louder, please.
I
okay.
think he was sound asleep.
Anyway, I was, I guess about 19 at the time, and very interested in a particular lady that I met at the pool, and got very disturbed by this arrogant SOB who kept trying to hit on her. And the guy troubled me a great deal because he preened like a bird, you know. I mean, his motion and the way he handled himself, I think the guys would both agree, was somewhat like a bird would take care of itself, you know. Anyway, during the course of that, it was in the summer, and I think at one point the young lady mentioned to Bob that I was a cartoonist. Of course, I did cartoons in the Navy, and a lot of other things in the Navy, but I had no idea that this was Bob Kane, because as a kid I used to copy some of the artwork that these guys were working on. And strangely enough, you know, she mentioned the fact that I was an aspiring young cartoonist, and he asked to see my work. And suddenly he didn't look so arrogant. And he got interested, strangely enough. And he said to me, listen, I may have some work for you in the fall, which is just a few weeks on, and I'll call you. And I'm damned if he didn't. And of course I was thrilled by that. And I worked on a Moonlight project. It was not Batman, it was a strip called Dusty Diamond that Bob said he and Will Eisner had concocted. But when I talked to Will about Dusty Diamond, he said, well, I won't tell you what he said. He's a nice guy. But he denied that he had a hand in anything with Bob Kane, none of which mattered to me. Bob hired me to do this thing, and I made a little money. And then what happened? I think I went to New York and tried to find work, and I worked for a guy named Rod Willett on Scorchy Smith. The idea excited me because of Kniff, obviously, who was my great hero. And I worked for Willett, I guess, for about 4 or 5 weeks, and decided I'd had enough. Went home on a weekend and wound up signing on to a Naval Reserve cruise for 3 months, which was okay. And I came back, I guess, late summer. And I started to look around for work again, and wound up being offered a strip by the New York Herald Tribune. So I had a contract with the Tribune when I was 20 years old, and had no idea until I was 30 what jerks they were. My God, I look back at that work and I wonder how the hell anybody could have wanted me, you know. But it was interesting, exciting, and it was my first trip to California, and I worked with a guy named Leslie Charteris, who was interesting in himself. He was about 6'3", Eurasian, and wore a monocle and no shoes, and started to drink at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I'm from New Bedford, Massachusetts, and I'm not quite 20 years old. So you can imagine what that was like.
So how did you get back into working with Bob?
He called me, and at some point, early in 47, and about mid-47, started sending me here. Bob was contracted for 12 stories a year, and I think what I understood was that he was getting around 300 a page. But if he did any extra work, am I close enough?
Whoops.
I guess not.
Mic still work.
Can you hear me back there?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Well, and the good Lord said. Anyway, Bob called and tried me out on a story, one script, a Bill Finger script, by the way. And I'll comment on that in a minute.
I think that must have
I
been-
will comment if the lights will stay on. Anyhow, you know, that seemed to work out pretty good. And at the same time, I was contemplating marriage. This is the following year, and I needed a job, and I got offered a job at King Features Syndicate as a staff artist. And Kniff really helped me get that job, and I would work on what they call rescales, and that is taking the tabloid page at that given time and make it into a third page or a quarter page, whatever, and add or subtract whatever needed to be done. So I was working at King Features anyway, and I had a deal where I could do my freelance work when I was finished with whatever stuff I had to do in my staff job. And
So how much did you do for Bob?
well, about 3 years ago, I got a call from one of the editors at DC, and he said, "Listen, we've been trying to finalize a list of titles, and about 3 years prior to that, a nice guy, a good friend of mine, Eddie Campbell, an Australian, by the way, had sent me a list, and he seemed to know every goddamn thing that I had done. I couldn't believe it. But in any event, it's about between 125 and 130.
130 stories, 130
Stories, yeah.
130 stories.
Right.
Now, during this time, to your knowledge, did Bob have somebody else ghosting for him? Or was it just
Well,
you?
there were certainly, I was sure, other artists that were working on Batman, but no, I was doing all of Bob's contract work. So in other words, I did the, helped him fulfill the 12 pages that he was contracted to. But then Bob discovered that I could do more than 12 pages. If he did more, the deal was that he got an extra 200 a page. So I became a cash cow for Bob. And he had no hesitation in letting me know how much he was getting. But I was so happy to have the extra work, you know, in those days.
Now you were penciling only.
Just pencils. And
Did Bob do any penciling to your knowledge?
I would turn over a pencil, and my pencils were extremely tight, very tight, especially on technical stuff, you know, and I had a very good file, a good swipe file, as Shelley mentioned. You needed that in those days. And what I would do is, I lived in Connecticut, and I would ride the train into New York and do all my layouts in a little book on the train. And then whatever time I had left in the afternoon, I would work on Batman. Then I'd go home and have dinner, and about 8 o'clock until about 12. I half watched all the TV shows and drew, and that was my routine. But I did roughly about 20 stories a year after we got started. Bob realized that I could turn out that many pencils.
Did Bob, to your knowledge, did Bob do any art corrections on your work?
No, he would occasionally, if there was a character, he would send me sketches, and I certainly used them.
Were they sketches by Bob?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, they were.
To check these things. So when did you stop working for him?
Mid-1947.
All right. Now, Shelley, when did you reconcile with Bob? What year did you get back with Bob?
I would say probably in the 60s.
Well,
Remember Fred Waring used to have his outing?
Right.
Would it be about that time? Every summer he invited the Cartoon Society. He invited the Cartoon Society to his
When did you
place.
start working? When did you start drawing again with Bob?
well, Shelley, I think, and you
I
can
don't
certainly
remember.
you can certainly
I don't
correct
remember.
me, but
Maybe 20 years later or something.